I think this is the interesting question. It's easy to say faith is just a virus. You believe it because you want to believe it. It gives you comfort. It makes your life easier. It's easy to say, you just believe because your parents believed you were born in a Christian culture. But actually, it's not easy to say that for everyone, is it? For a start, there are lots of people in the world for whom becoming a Christian and believing in Christ hasn't made their life easier. It certainly wasn't the case for the Christians of the first 3 centuries of church history who faced persecution and opposition. And it's certainly not the case for the majority of Christians in the world today. There was an article in the Independent newspaper a couple of years ago that said that Christians are now the most persecuted people group in the world today. 80% of all acts of violence against people groups are directed towards Christians. So it's just not the case that for Christians in the world today, becoming a Christian makes their life easier and they follow Jesus because it gives their life comforts. For many, it leads to opposition. I think of a friend of mine who had to flee his home and his country because becoming a Christian meant that those around him wanted to kill him. The idea that Christianity was just a comfort blanket or a crutch which doesn't really sit with the evidence of that kind of situation. Similarly, there are people who don't come to believe because they want to believe. In fact, they come to believe in spite of the fact they don't want to believe. C.S. Lewis is probably the most famous example of that historically. When he finally came to belief in God, he writes in his semi-autobiographical book, Surprised by Joy, "I was the most reluctant convert in all of England." He didn't believe because he wanted to believe, but in spite of his not wanting to believe, he came to a conviction that it was true. I was speaking to a girl at a university just recently, and she had many, many objections to the Christian faith. At the end of the week, she still had many objections, but she continued to meet up with a Christian friend. I heard just recently that she'd become a Christian, and she said in her own words, she said, "I didn't want it to be true, but I couldn't escape the fact eventually that it was. But now I've become a Christian, I am glad that it is true." But she didn't come to that conviction because it was simply a crutch. She came to it because she was convinced by the evidence that it was true. And similarly with the argument that Christianity is just a virus, something you pick up from your culture or from your family. That would assume, therefore, that everyone who becomes a Christian comes from a Christian culture or comes from a Christian family. But again, think of the first Christians. No one in the first generation of the Christian faith came from a Christian family or lived in a Christian culture. In fact, culture didn't become Christian until the 4th century, you might say. And similarly today, where is the Christian faith growing most rapidly? Not in Western Europe, in places that are considered kind of traditionally Christian, but in places like Iran, in places like Algeria, in places like Mongolia. Places that are not considered traditionally Christian, and where most of the Christians who have come to faith in Christ haven't come from a Christian family. They're not simply copying their culture, they're not simply copying their parents' belief, but they've come to an encounter with a God who is there and come to put their faith in him. So I think the reality of what goes on in our world today completely defeats this idea that faith is just a crutch or a virus. It just doesn't make sense when you look at the reality of what happens.